Welcome to Grave Whispers. I've sifted through case files, newspaper clippings, and overlooked details to piece these stories together. Some of the cases you'll recognize, others you may not have heard of, but all hold something worth uncovering. What I've found isn't always neat, and it isn't always complete, but it's real, and now it's yours to hear. Today, a roadside discovery would trigger drones, DNA sequencing, and interstate data alerts within hours. In 1985, investigators had none of that. They worked with Polaroids, hand-drawn maps, and evidence sealed in paper envelopes. When the bodies of young women began appearing along Tennessee's highways, some nameless, some unrecognizable, police could only guess where to start. Each scene looked the same: a ditch off the interstate, a blanket or clothing tossed nearby, a woman with reddish hair, and no identification. Reports crossed county and state lines faster than evidence could ever. And for years, no one could tell whether they were chasing one killer or several who traveled the same roads. What followed was confusion, fear, and a story that stretched across 6 different states. Between 1983 and 1985, law enforcement agencies across the American South began confronting a disturbing pattern. Along major highways in Tennessee, Kentucky, and Arkansas, the bodies of young women were discovered under strikingly similar circumstances. Each scene carried a grim familiarity. Victims found near the interstate, the exits or access roads, often unclothed or partially dressed, and their personal belongings missing or discarded nearby. Many shared one noticeable characteristic: reddish or auburn hair. The media soon gave the killings a name that would linger for decades: the Redhead Murders. At the time, few investigators recognized the scope of what was unfolding. Jurisdictional boundaries meant that each case was logged independently, investigated by different departments, and often filed away without awareness of comparable crimes just a few hundred miles away. In an era before computerized databases and DNA analysis, even basic communication between counties was limited to phone calls and faxed reports. What appeared to one sheriff's office as an isolated homicide began to echo across state lines as others reported similar findings. By the spring of 1985, at least 6 bodies had been found along the region's main freight corridors, Interstates 24, 40, 75, and 81. These routes cut directly through Tennessee's commercial center, carrying thousands of long-haul trucks each day. Investigators quietly began to suspect a transient offender, perhaps a truck driver, using the highways as both his hunting ground and his disposal route. But with no reliable witness accounts, no surveillance technology, and limited forensic tools, their theories rested largely on geography and circumstance. For the victims, justice came slowly, if at all. Most had no identification, leaving authorities to classify them as Jane Does and bury them in unmarked graves. In several cases, even the most basic details, hair color, approximate age, cause of death, were recorded imperfectly or lost altogether. It would take nearly 40 years and the advent of forensic genealogy before many of these women were finally named and their stories recovered from decades of silence. Each of the 6 confirmed victims represents a fragment of a broader, haunting narrative. A story of women traveling alone, last seen alive somewhere near an interstate, and then disappearing without a trace. Tina Marie McKenney Farmer, 21, was traveling home for Christmas in 1984 when she vanished. Her body was discovered on New Year's Day along Interstate 75 in Campbell County, Tennessee. She had been strangled, bound, and left beneath a blanket. She was also several weeks pregnant. For more than 3 decades, her killer remained unknown until modern DNA analysis identified the perpetrator, a long-haul truck driver named Jerry Leon Johns. Lisa Nichols, 28, had recently relocated between Tennessee and Arkansas, hoping to start over. In the fall of 1984, she disappeared. Her skeletal remains were found that September near West Memphis, just off of Interstate 40, and only a few miles from the Mississippi River Bridge. Her hair was described as reddish-brown, and the proximity to a major trucking corridor placed her among the earliest suspected victims. Elizabeth Lamotte, 17, had fled from a youth development center in Manchester, New Hampshire in 1983. 2 years later, and more than 1,000 miles from her home, her body was discovered in Greene County, Tennessee. She had been beaten and stabbed before being left beneath the pines bordering Interstate 81. Her identification would not come until 2018, when genealogical DNA connected her remains to a family still living in New England. Tracy Sue Walker, 15, disappeared from Lafayette, Indiana in 1978. For decades, her family searched, unaware that her remains had already been recovered in 1985 from a wooded hillside near Interstate 75 in Campbell County, Tennessee. It was not until 2022 that forensic genealogy confirmed her identity, closing a 37-year gap between disappearance and discovery. She too bore the auburn hair that helped shape the case's infamous title. S.B. Regina Black Pilgrim, a young mother. She was found in Knox County, Kentucky, under particularly grim circumstances. Her body had been placed inside an abandoned refrigerator dumped along a rural highway feeder road. Hidden from view and stripped of identification, she too bore the auburn hair that helped shape the case's infamous title. Michelle Lavone Inman was 24, lived near Nashville, and was believed to be local to the area. Her remains were found in 1985 near Interstate 24, but her identity remained unknown until 2023, when advanced DNA sequencing restored her name after nearly 4 decades. Different towns, different roads, yet each story mirrored the next, a repeating pattern of young women lost along the highways of the South, their lives converging only in death, bound together by the same quiet violence that haunted a generation of investigators. For decades, investigators could only speculate whether the series of highway murders were truly connected or merely just the product of coincidence. But then, in 2019, one case finally broke the silence. Analysts with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation revisited the evidence from the murder of Tina Marie McKinney Farmer, the one whose body had been found along Interstate 75 in Campbell County in January of 1985. Among the preserved materials collected from the scene was a blanket used to cover her remains. When retested with modern forensic technology, the fabric revealed biological evidence that had survived more than 30 years. DNA sequencing identified a clear match: Jerry Leon Johns, a long-haul truck driver from Cleveland, Tennessee. At the time of the discovery, Johns was already in prison for another violent crime. Just days before Tina's body was found, he had picked up a young hitchhiker near Knoxville, strangled her with a cord, and left her for dead beside the same highway. Against all odds, she survived. Her testimony later secured John's conviction for kidnapping and attempted murder. The parallels between the two cases were unmistakable. Same region, same method, same time frame. For the first time, investigators could confirm at least one perpetrator behind a killing once grouped within the Redhead Murders. Yet, the breakthrough brought as many questions as it did answers. Johns died in prison in 2015, 4 years before the DNA match was confirmed. He was never interviewed about the other victims, and no additional evidence ever linked him to their deaths. His genetic profile tied him exclusively to Tina Farmer, and to no one else. If there was a pattern to these murders, it was carved into the asphalt. Every victim was discovered near a major interstate. Those vast arteries of commerce that connect the industrial South, Interstate 40 cut west from Knoxville to Memphis, threading through the state's shipping core. Interstate 75 climbed north into Kentucky, a primary freight route for long-haul carriers. Interstate 24 wound its way past Nashville, while Interstate 81 traced the eastern edge of Tennessee towards Virginia. Each of these roadways functioned as both lifeline and hunting ground. The victims disappeared along corridors crowded with truck stops, diners, motels, and rest areas. Transient spaces where strangers could come and go unnoticed. To investigators, the consistency of those locations suggested the work of someone who knew the highways intimately, perhaps a commercial driver who could travel between states without attracting attention. By early 1985, the map of recovery sites formed a crude cross over Tennessee, with its center anchored around Knoxville. Law enforcement theorized that the killer, or killers, were truckers who understood how to navigate the state's interstates undetected, where to pull off the road unseen, where patrol coverage was thin, and where a body might remain hidden long enough for the clues to fade. It was a compelling hypothesis, but it stopped short of proof. No tire impressions matched from one scene to another. No consistent fibers or tools connected the victims. No shared schedule or delivery route emerged from trucking records. What lingered instead was a chilling realization that during that winter, thousands of drivers crossed the same highways, and any one of them potentially passed a victim moments before she vanished, or again days later, unaware that her body lay just beyond the guardrail. The name Redhead Murders did not emerge from the evidence. It came from the headlines. In 1985, reporters began to notice that several of the unidentified victims found along the southern highways were described as having red or auburn hair. That detail became the defining feature of the story, a shorthand that captured public attention. It was simple, memorable, and unsettling. Everything a headline required. Within months, the phrase spread across newspapers and television broadcasts, and soon any unsolved roadside homicide involving a woman with even a trace of red in her hair was grouped under the same ominous banner. The truth, however, that was far less uniform. Of the 6 confirmed victims now linked to the case, only 2 were confirmed natural redheads. The others had brown or light hair with reddish tones, and one so decomposed that only skeletal remains were recovered, had no verifiable hair color at all. The nickname endured not because it was accurate, but because it gave a complex, multi-state investigation a single, haunting identity. That label shaped the public narrative far more than facts ever did. It implied a pattern that might never have existed. A lone predator selecting women for their appearance. A phantom driven by fixation rather than opportunity. In reality, investigators found no evidence of such targeting. What connected these women was not the color of their hair, but the highways where they were last seen and the circumstances of their disappearance. Decades later, the phrase Redhead Murders persists, a reminder of how myth can outlast certainty and how the stories we tell about violence can obscure the truth it leaves behind. Nearly 40 years later, the pattern still refuses to take a definite shape. The evidence does not agree on a single perpetrator. 2 of the victims were strangled, 1 was bludgeoned, another asphyxiated, and 2 were found way too decomposed for examiners to determine a cause of death. No consistent ligature material has ever been recovered, no reoccurring knot style, no shared fiber or trace element, and no matching tire or vehicle pattern links one scene to the next. Their backgrounds vary just as widely. Some of the women were confirmed runaways, living transient lives that left few records behind. Others were locals who simply vanished between home and work. The intervals between their deaths stretched from weeks to years, erasing the sense of a single, continuous killing spree. Even with today's technology, most of these cases remain silent. Many original evidence samples degraded in storage, while others were never preserved in the first place. A handful of counties lost their reports altogether or sealed them under laws that predate digital archiving. Tennessee's lone DNA match confirmed that Jerry Leon Johns murdered Tina Marie McKinney Farmer, but beyond that, every other case exists in the uncertain space between theory and proof. Investigators cannot say with confidence whether these women fell prey to one man moving along the interstates or to several who traveled the same roads, guided by not a shared motive, but by the same dangerous anonymity that the highways offered. All that remains is a trail of victims, linked by circumstance, divided by evidence, and bound together by absence. The women once buried as Jane Does are finally reclaiming their identities. Through forensic genealogy and next-generation DNA sequencing, investigators have begun restoring the names lost to time along Tennessee's highways. In 2018, Elizabeth Lamotte was identified through genetic matches to family members in New Hampshire, ending 33 years of uncertainty. In 2022, Tracy Sue Walker regained her name after nearly 4 decades thanks to whole genome sequencing performed by the University of North Texas and Othram's Forensic Lab. A year later, Michelle Lavone Inman was confirmed through advanced DNA analysis. Her remains matched to a local woman who had vanished from Nashville in 1985. Each identification brought a measure of truth, but not justice. No additional suspects have been named, no trials held, and no convictions reached. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation continues to re-examine preserved evidence, while neighboring states quietly reopen their own unsolved highway homicides, searching for genetic matches in databases that did not exist when these women died. Their killer, or killers, may never stand before a judge, yet with every confirmed name, a fragment of their stolen identity is returned. For the families left behind, that small act of recognition matters. It is the beginning of something larger. The right for these women to be remembered, not by the color of their hair, nor by the myth that followed them, but by their names. Thank you for listening to Grave Whispers. The story of the Redhead Murders is one of confusion, neglect, and silence that spanned nearly 40 years. Evidence was scattered across counties, names were lost, and myths took the place of truth. I believe the DNA evidence leaves little doubt. Jerry Leon Johns was responsible for at least one of these murders, the death of Tina Marie McKinney Farmer. But I can't help but wonder, was he responsible for more than just the one? However, the only person who can answer that for certain died in prison in 2015. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Was Johns responsible for just one, or is he responsible for multiple of the murders? Until next time, keep questioning, and keep listening for the whispers.